Lesson 12.
One of Mr. Rain's favourite topics.
Fascinatingly interesting, the Prague Spring. You're probably thinking to yourself, Prague, I know where that is. That is in the Czech Republic.
Romanovia.
And which you'd be right to say today. But back then, both the countries of the Czech Republic and Slovakia were united in one country known as Czechoslovakia.
So, this idea of détente we're going to mention in more detail. Actually, the period of détente goes throughout this whole period, but we like to look at the Prague Spring, as the examiners like to look at the Prague Spring as a separate thing. Détente essentially means a cooling of relations, i.e. a calming of relations, that relations are getting better. So this, as we mentioned last session, it follows the Cuban Missile Crisis, as both parties realised how close things came to nuclear war and make a double effort to try again. Now, in this story, in 1968, the Soviet Union will invade Czechoslovakia for reasons we'll go into and test this détente. Even despite that, though, as we shall see, détente largely survives, and détente will survive until 1979 with the invasion of Afghanistan. But the real symbolism of Czechoslovakia is almost similar to Hungary, with this idea that it shows that the Russians will challenge anyone who tries to reform the Eastern Bloc countries in a way that threatens the Warsaw Pact and their control over these Eastern European countries. And the important thing where people go wrong is this is Prague, and the Hungary one is Hungary. And there'll be a lot of confusion between the two. And when you do a revision, you need to make sure you know very clearly what the difference is, because the story in many regards is the same, except for slightly forward. This one's slightly less extreme. No one dies.
And it's important to note here that it should read that they would not tolerate reforms which threaten Soviet control over any state which is in their Eastern European sphere of influence. So, what was Czechoslovakia like in the early Cold War? Up to 1960, it had been basically the perfect satellite.
The model student.
Yeah, the model student. When the Hungarians were sort of kicking off in 1956, the Czechoslovakians were held up as the model. Their economy and their standard of living was good. Their government had followed Moscow's lead. Unquestionably, they were members of the Warsaw Pact, members of the Czechoslovakian army, helped the Soviet invasion of Hungary. They are in every way the perfect state for the Soviet Union. But there are also building problems, of course, underneath this veneer of success. There are actually fundamental issues. The Russians had behaved incredibly badly in 1948. They had murdered several of the democratic leaders, the people sort of pushing for Czechoslovakia to ally itself with the West and the United States. And when the Russians take power, and as if you remember from early on in the course, effectively through rigged elections and using their secret police, they basically seize any political opposition and murder these people. In Czechoslovakia is ruled from 1948 to 1957 by a man named Anton Novotny. And Novotny is incredibly unpopular. He followed a very Stalinistic Soviet line. He refused any reforms. He wanted to keep the Czechoslovakia like Stalinist Russia. When Khrushchev announced in a secret speech that he would de-Stalinize and open up, Novotny did not want to follow Khrushchev's de-Stalinization and wanted to keep things the way they were under Stalin. As a result, by the 1960s, Czechoslovakia, although initially the most successful of the Soviet satellite states, starts to fall into a period of decline. Their economy very much hurt by the sort of the rigors of Comecon and the nature of the what they were forcing them to do. They forced the Czechoslovaks in many ways to make a lot of machinery, in other words, tractors and cars and tanks and things like that, which put an over-reliance on heavy industry. As a result, the economy is really unbalanced. There's not enough food. The standard of living falls. The production of raw materials, as I mentioned, most of this was sent to the Soviet Union, and the Czechs effectively need the material and the things that they needed to make the lives of the people of Czechoslovakia better are basically usurped and under Comecon and sent to the Soviet Union. Czech factories don't produce consumer goods. If you're in Czech Republic, try and get a car, try and get a fridge, try and get the basics of a modern life, almost impossible to get. And as a result, Novotny becomes under major pressure.
So, this failure of the economy, as always, leads to political dissent. It doesn't help that Czechoslovakia is on the border and was always the more westernized of the Eastern European countries. In fact, Czechoslovakia was always considered itself, before the communist takeover, a Western country rather than an Eastern country. So there is a real demand for greater democracy. Not necessarily anti-communism at this point, but the idea that we need to have a democratic choice, or there needs to be at least an element of democracy within communism. And in October 1967, there are various reformers from within the Communist Party itself, including this chap here, Dubček, and Sik, who challenged Novotny's leadership in the Central Committee. Now, interestingly, Dubček is playing a smart game. In December, he invites the new Soviet leader Brezhnev, remember Khrushchev gets fired in '64, to Prague. And while he's there, and almost deliberately by Dubček's design, Brezhnev sees the level of opposition, the protests, the strikes, etc., emerging, which Novotny had kept under wraps. Now, Dubček is playing a smart game. He knows full well what he's doing. Brezhnev, though, didn't realise that this was the case, and therefore Brezhnev, looking for sort of security and order in his Eastern Bloc countries, withholds support openly for Novotny on his visit. He says the Czechoslovakian people are very good, he says the Communist Party is very good, all the sort of standard stuff, but he, in the same time, doesn't mention anything about Novotny, which is a very, in the world of like runes and symbols that is, the Communist Party means a lot.
So what happens is, in a move supported by Brezhnev after his visit, he basically props up Dubček and forces Novotny to resign. Novotny is replaced on the 5th of January 1968.
I think it's very important to realise that without Brezhnev's implicit support, this would not have happened.
Yeah, Novotny would have continued on as he had since 1948. So in March 1968, Novotny resigns as president, and he's replaced by a man named General Svoboda. He's a war hero whose name means freedom. Now, in the way the Czechoslovakian government was structured, you have to understand that there's a first secretary and a president, and the president was kept there in a way to show the West that it had sort of a democratic structure. So in Britain, we have a queen as the head of state, and then the prime minister, who is effectively the man in charge. In the Czechoslovakia under communism, they had a president and a first secretary, even though the first secretary was the man who did most of the day-to-day running of the country. Now, nominally, actually, under Novotny, he held both of those positions, and in a very, very short period of time, he is forced to step down from both. General Svoboda takes over as a sort of the nominal head of state, the president, and Dubček takes over effectively the running of the country as first secretary.
So, this is why we're getting confused. So far, we've got a bad man who runs the economy into the ground, people get angry, and he's replaced by a more moderate. And what Dubček will do is embark on a series of reforms that go into more detail in the next slide. But essentially, this becomes known as the Prague Spring, the springing forth of new ideas. And they all can be summed up with Dubček's own statement that he wants to create socialism, or communism, depending on translation, with a human face. What that means is he is still a socialist. He doesn't want capitalism, he doesn't want democracy, but he wants to make it more free, less based on terror, more based on the fact that people genuinely have a nice life under communism.
And really sort of reform a lot of the things that Comecon were doing. In other words, so, Comecon wouldn't let the Czechoslovakians produce consumer goods that the people wanted and needed in many ways. So what they decided to do with socialism in human face is maybe make a more well-rounded economy, an economy that not only produces the heavy industry and steel that's required for the larger Soviet bloc, but also an economy that provides for its people to improve their standard of living.
Absolutely right. He does not necessarily want democracy and capitalism in of itself, although he wants to remove the worst parts of communism. That might mean greater local democracy, as we shall see in other political parties, but fundamentally he is a communist.
So what are Dubček's reforms? They're fivefold. Number one, greater political freedom. He wants freedom of speech, which is something the Czechoslovakians didn't have. He wants freedom of press. At this point, the Soviet Union controlled all of the newspapers. He wanted more of an open newspaper system. He wanted radio and television to be free, and the limits that were placed on what people can say by Soviet control to be reduced. The second, he wants to institute a 10-year program for political change. This would move from sort of the central system run almost entirely by Novotny at this point to a system over which over a 10-year party would have a multi-party system, democratic elections, what he calls democratic socialism. So in other words, it would give people more say in the running of the country. But this is not a break from socialism. They're not going to automatically run a capitalist party, but they're allowing people to choose which type of socialist party would come to power. The third reform was a reduction in the powers of the secret police and the idea of imprisonment without trial. Of course, since 1948, the Stalinist policies of Novotny had given the Czechoslovakian secret police very much unlimited power. They could arrest people, people could disappear, people could be put on trial without any real sense of charges against them. They can be imprisoned without trial, etc., etc. All of these things would be limited. They wanted to remove travel restrictions. Up until this point, the Czechoslovakians weren't actually allowed to leave their country. They could travel limitedly through the Eastern Bloc, but they certainly weren't allowed to go to the West. A vacation to the United States or France, even a very close neighbor, was completely out of the question. So they wanted to remove travel restrictions, and they wanted, again, to open up economic ties with their old principal trading partner, which was Germany, but more acutely the Allied-controlled democratic West German state. And lastly, as far as they wanted to create works councils, and these works councils would represent the workforce to improve working conditions in factories and increase trade union recognition. So under the Soviets and under a Comecon, the ability for workers to organize themselves into trade unions to lobby their employers for better working conditions and pay is limited. The secret police would crush any trade union organization. People were not allowed to complain. They had to go to work, do it, and go home. They got what they got. That was the end. He wanted the creation of workers' councils. In other words, a reestablishment of trade unionism in order to help the lives of the factory workers.
So, what's the reaction to this? In reality, the USSR, as you shall see, will grow concerned, because as soon as you give a little bit of reform, people demand even more. As soon as you give free speech, for example, people can start using that free speech to demand more democracy. People can use that free speech to start criticising the government, which the government either has to react or crack down on. And so we see the formation of a rival party called the Social Democratic Party. And this guy whose name I am going to massacre, so let's hope for the best, Ludwig Vakulik.
Good job.
Okay, well, what do you reckon?
Ludwig Vakulik.
You said the same thing in a slightly racist accent.
And it sounded better.
Published a manifesto called The 2000 Words, where he argued for even more that people should go further, force a more extreme form of reform. Like, in the eyes of many people, Dubček was a good guy, but he had been forced into this situation, and Russia had been forced into accepting it because of the people power. And the argument, therefore, was let's expand the people power so that we can get even more reforms. Now, the USSR watches this escalating series of reforms in an increasingly concerned manner. Number one, Czechoslovakia is in the middle of the Warsaw Pact, and if you look at the geography of it, it's almost like a dagger at the heart of the Eastern European countries. It spreads, it's long and thin, spreads all the way around. If it went to NATO, it would be a real compromise in terms of where the Allies could attack the Eastern Europe from. As well as that, it massively increases the border they would have to defend. Brezhnev, as well as that, does not want people to start leaving the Warsaw Pact, because as soon as one person leaves, what's the precedent on that? And more people will leave, etc., etc., etc. So, Brezhnev is also under pressure from his East German counterparts and Polish leaders as well, who are much more authoritarian and Stalinist in their approach. The word of the reforms is spreading across the border of Eastern Europe, and as people get the idea, particularly East Germany and Poland, which share borders with Czechoslovakia, there's a fear that if this is not continued, that would also challenge their own rules.
This is important to note. Exactly the same thing that influenced Khrushchev in his reaction to Hungary. They do not want, this whole idea, if I give one to you, I have to give one to everyone else. And this is not something that the Soviets are willing to do. They do not want to give up control.
Absolutely right. And finally, Brezhnev also fears that As it moves closer to West Germany in the west, the West might start dominating the economy of Czechoslovakia and therefore have political influence on Czechoslovakia. Now, Brezhnev, to give him his credit, does not send tanks in straight away. It's important to know that during exercises that were planned anyway in June, those tanks which are having exercises in that practice wars almost, in Russian tanks in Czechoslovakia, do not leave. Now, they're not doing anything, but you can tell Brezhnev is sort of backing up his options. He's keeping his cards close to his chest, but also he's always got a trump card. If he needs to, therefore, he reserves the ability to quickly use military force. But the fact that he doesn't use them straight away, instead tries to negotiate, shows that he's trying to keep this bit together without using force. He knows, for example, what that caused in Hungary and how that will look to the West, particularly this period of detente, where they're trying to be friends. And as you can see, I'm sure in your textbooks they've got a nice delineation. What happens is a series of meetings where Brezhnev will talk to the Eastern Bloc, they will say, sort this out. Brezhnev will talk to Dubček, he will say, you know what, I promise not to do any more reforms. Brezhnev will say fine, and then there'll be more reforms, and Brezhnev will talk to Dubček and say, you sure you've got control of this? And Dubček will say, it's fine, I promise not to do more. And this keeps on going until we see the sort of Soviet invasion.
So what we have here is really a period between June 1968 and August 1920, when the Soviets eventually invade and take over. So I'll just run you through the events really quickly. So as Mr. Suter mentioned, in June 1968, Soviet tanks that were in Czechoslovakia on training exercises basically remain. Brezhnev leaves them there in case things start to kick off. By July of that year, 1968, Brezhnev will meet with Dubček to start expressing concerns over the events in Prague. Dubček agrees basically not to leave the Warsaw Pact and not to allow the Social Democratic Party, but he's also incessant on reform. On the 3rd of August, Dubček will meet all members of the Warsaw Pact in Czechoslovakia's second biggest city, Bratislava, and they'll sign a declaration in Bratislava called the Bratislava Declaration, which expresses Czechoslovakia's faith in communism. Again, it's a reassurance that we're not going to leave, guys. We're still going to be with you, but we want some changes here. And interestingly enough, at the same time, Yugoslavian leader Marshal Tito visits Prague and is given a relatively warm welcome. Tito had been one of the only Eastern European countries, or the head of one of the only Eastern European countries to successfully resist Russian Soviet domination in the immediate aftermath of World War II. Tito was a dictator who was head of the country known as Yugoslavia, which is now made up of several countries in the Balkans, Croatia, Serbia, etc., etc. But he visits at the same time and is given a really warm welcome, which sends a very disconcerting message. On one hand, you have Dubček and all of these people saying, well, we have faith in communism. On the other hand, all of the people are clapping for the person who stood up to communism and is not running a communist state. So there's a lot of things that are beginning to really worry the Russians. By the 15th of August, the Soviet Politburo, sort of the government organization, will meet, and they'll meet over 3 days, and they'll basically try to come up or hammer out what they are going to do about the Prague Spring. And famously, Brezhnev shouts at Dubček on the phone following the meeting of the Politburo that his actions will bring down the Warsaw Pact. And it's very clear that the Politburo's decision was that they need to crush any sort of reform in Czechoslovakia. On the 20th of August, they invade.
So the troops from across the Warsaw Pact countries, particularly Poland and East Germany, which are the most concerned, take part in this invasions. Now, the Czech citizens do resist with petrol bombs and protests in Prague and barricades in the streets, but Dubček tells his people not to resist. It's clearly a futile effort. And we don't see the same level of violence and killing that we do in Hungary in Czechoslovakia. In Czechoslovakia, there are some brief skirmishes, but fewer than 100 people are killed. It's much more about argument and broadcasting than about anything else. Dubček finds himself arrested and taken to Moscow and forced to end the reforms. And they are basically the leaders of Czechoslovakia are replaced with far more loyal and hard-line officials than who would do what Brezhnev asks. It's important to realise, though, that Dubček does not end up being killed. He becomes the ambassador to Turkey. This is a different sort of dynamic, and I would say where the Prague Spring and the Warsaw Uprising really differ is what happens in the invasion. Because the Czechs don't choose to fight, and because Brezhnev is desperately trying to keep up the détente, this idea that, no, guys, let's be friends, etc., etc. He's willing to take a more sort of nuanced, more fair line, and nothing is more symbolic than the fact that Dubček technically gets, well, not a promotion, but like technically gets a sweet gig. Obviously, being an ambassador to Turkey guarantees you nothing but a nice house, really. But he isn't up against the wall and shot in Romania.
Here's some interesting pictures. So here's some interesting pictures of the Prague Spring. Now, this, I suppose, begs the consequences of begs the question, what are the consequences of this invasion? Now, there are many and varied. Number one, and let's take a look at Czechoslovakia. Demonstrations went on against the Soviet Union until April 1969. In January 1969, Jan Palash, a student, famously set fire to himself in protest of the invasion, and this was captured on film, sent worldwide. I guess in the West, it does a lot to show, that the Soviet Union is the evil empire, they're bad, etc., etc. Look at these people yearning for freedom and what the lengths in which they're willing to go. The Czech Communist Party is purged of any reformists by the Soviet Union, and though Dubček is not executed, he's sent off to Turkey to become the ambassador, and then he eventually forced to resign from the Communist Party. What is probably most important is what happens in the Soviet Union. It really gives rise to what's known as the Brezhnev Doctrine. Now, we know the Truman Doctrine. The Prague Spring gives rise to the Brezhnev Doctrine. And the Brezhnev Doctrine, under Brezhnev, of course, basically redefines communism as a one-party system and declares very distinctly that all member states must, without fail, remain part of the Warsaw Pact. Any group that wants to leave the Warsaw Pact will be invaded. So in other words, a message is sent very clearly to the rest of the Eastern Bloc that the Soviet Union will invade any country in their sphere of influence who threatens to leave the Warsaw Pact. And any attempt to relax, if you will, communist control will result in invasion. That's
right. So the consequences and significance of both these countries. Obviously, Czechoslovakia goes fundamentally against the reforms. Soviet Union, though, ensured for basically a generation that there's not going to be any more attempts to break the Warsaw Pact. What about more broadly? The Warsaw Pact, actually, in some regards, is weakened. Some countries see what's going on here, and they're increasingly chafing, and sort of having difficulty and pain under the economic and political demands of Russia. So, trying to express their discontent by refusing to send troops. Albania doesn't send troops, Romania doesn't send troops, and Albania will in turn leave the Warsaw Pact in 1968. Slightly different circumstances. It's more associated with Tito and it's more allied with Tito. As well as that, it's so insignificant, and Brezhnev's used all his sort of cards. Brezhnev doesn't want to start a civil war between Yugoslavia and Russia, so he sort of lets it happen. The USSR really doesn't react to this. So in many regards, seeing this kick off, people go, they are bullies, let's just walk away now. More than that, on broader Cold War tensions, obviously it makes things worse. We're in a period of détente where both the relations are thawing, that both parties want to get on. But the USA and Britain almost have to declare that this is bad. They stand for freedom, they stand for democracy, they stand for reform, and now there's a reform, freedom, democracy sort of type. They've got to criticise it. And in public, they do, and this causes a bit of tension between Brezhnev and the leaders of these countries. However, there is a true understanding that actually, among even Britain and France, that this isn't important enough to have a real issue over, and actually better to keep the period of détente. So détente isn't massively affected by it, only in the first few years. This is also helped by the fact that the USA, by this point, is preoccupied with Vietnam, and the Czech crisis really takes pressure on the USA to really do anything. USA can't really be bothered to get involved in anything here. Again, it's not worth it with détente, but also it's not they don't have the manpower or anything to really follow through any threats, because all their soldiers and money are being tied up in an increasingly costly war in Vietnam. As well as this, though, and interestingly, and examiners always like this because everyone forgets about China, is it does increase divisions between China and the USSR. China thinks that because China is such a bit more strict, says that Soviets reacted too slowly and entertained this reformism too much. And China starts really drifting at this point. And as we shall see, we're going to end up in a weird situation where it's going to be America and China allied against, well, not officially allied, but making friends against the USSR. And this is really the next step. This is, of course, the next step towards that ultimate goal. So overall, what are the consequences? For Russia, they bank the Eastern Warsaw Pact for another generation, despite losing a couple of countries, emotionally or physically. For the Cold War, there's a brief tension increase, but because both sides know that it's in the eastern sphere of influence, that Czechoslovakia is not really worth it, and they go back to business as usual detente. What harms detente much more will be Vietnam than anything else. So, from me,
I'm Mr. Rain.
I'm Mr. Suter.
Take care.